this time strengthened himself so much that he was ready for battle. He accordingly marched on to the attack. He directed his assault in the first instance on the wing of Richard's army, which was formed of the French troops that were under the command of the Duke of Burgundy. They resisted them successfully and drove them back. Richard watched the operation, but for a time took no part in it, except to make feigned advances from time to time to threaten the enemy, and to harass them by compelling them to perform numerous fatiguing evolutions. His soldiers, and especially the knights and barons in his army, were very impatient at his delaying so long to take an active and efficient part in the contest. But at last, when he found that the Saracen troops were wearied, and were beginning to be thrown in a little confusion, he gave the signal for a charge, and rode forward at the head of the troop, mounted on his famous charger, and flourishing his heavy battle-axe in the air. The onset was terrible. Richard inspirited his whole troop by his reckless and headlong bravery, and by the terrible energy with which he gave himself to the work of slaughtering all who came in his way. The darts and javelins that were shot by the enemy glanced off from him without inflicting any wound, being turned aside by the steel armour that he wore, while every person that came near enough to him to strike him with any other weapon was felled at once to the ground by a blow from the ponderous battle-axe. The example which Richard thus set was followed by his men, and in a short time the Saracens began everywhere to give way. When, in the case of such a combat, one side begins to yield, it is all over with them. When they turn to retreat, they of course become at once defenceless, and the pursuers press on upon them, killing them without mercy and at their pleasure, and with very little danger of being killed themselves. A man can fight very well while he is pursuing, but scarcely at all when he is being pursued. It was not long before Saladin's army was flying in all directions, the Crusaders pressing upon them everywhere in their confusion, and cutting them down mercilessly in great numbers. The slaughter was immense. About 7,000 of the Saracen troops were slain. Among them were 32 of Saladin's highest and best officers. As soon as the Saracens escaped the immediate danger, when the Crusaders had given over the pursuit, they had rallied, and Saladin formed them again into something like order. He then commenced a regular and formal retreat into the interior. He first, however, sent detachments to all the country around to dismantle the towns, to destroy all the stores of provisions, and to seize and carry away everything of value that could be of any use to the conquerors. A broad extent of the country, through which Richard would have to march in advancing towards Jerusalem, being thus laid waste, the Saracens withdrew farther into the interior, and there Saladin set himself at work to reorganize his broken army once more, and to prepare for new plans of resistance to the invaders. Richard withdrew his army to Jaffa, and, taking possession of the town, he established himself there. It was now September. The season of the year was very hot and unhealthy, and though the Allied army had thus far been victorious, still there was a great deal of sickness in the camp, and the soldiers were much exhausted by the fatigue which they had endured, and by their exposure to the sun. Richard was desirous, notwithstanding this, to take the field again, and advance into the interior, so as to follow up the victory which had been gained over Saladin at Azotus. But his officers, especially those of the French division of the army, under the command of the Duke of Burgundy, thought it not safe to move forward so soon. It would be better to remain a short time in Jaffa, they said, to recruit the army and to prepare for advancing in a more secure and efficient manner. Besides, they said, we need Jaffa for a military post, and it will be best to remain here until we shall have repaired the fortifications and put the place in a good condition of defence. But this was only an excuse. What the army really desired was to enjoy repose for a time. They found it much more agreeable to live in ease and indulgence within the walls of a town than to march in the hot sun across so arid a country, loaded down as they were with heavy armour, and kept constantly in a state of anxious and watchful suspense by the danger of sudden attacks from the enemy. Richard acceded to the wishes of the officers, and decided to remain for a time in Jaffa, but they, instead of devoting themselves energetically to making good again the fortifications of the town, went very languidly to the work. They allowed themselves and the men to spend their time in inaction and indulgence. In the meantime, Saladin had gathered his forces together again, and was drawing fresh recruits every day to his standard from the interior of the country. He was preparing for a more vigorous resistance than ever. Richard has been strongly condemned for thus remaining inactive in Jaffa after the Battle of Azotus. Historians, narrating the account of his campaign, say that he ought to have marched at once towards Jerusalem before Saladin should have had time to organise any new means of resistance. But it is impossible for those who are at a distance from the scene of action in such a case, and who have only that partial and imperfect account of the facts which can be obtained through the testimony of others, to form any reliable judgment on such a question. Whether it would be prudent or imprudent for a commander to advance after a battle can be known in general only to those who are on the ground, and who have personal knowledge of all the circumstances of the case. While Richard remained in Jaffa, he made frequent excursions into the surrounding territory at the head of a small troop of adventurous men who liked to accompany him. Other small detachments were often sent out. These parties went sometimes to collect forage, and sometimes to reconnoitre the country, with a view of ascertaining Saladin's position and plans. Richard took great delight in these excursions, nor were they attended with any great danger. At the present day, going out on reconnoitring parties is very dangerous service indeed, for men wear no armour, and they are liable at any moment to be cut down by a Mini rifle ball, fired from an unseen hand a mile away. In those days the case was very different. There were no missiles that could be thrown for a greater distance than a few yards, and for all such the heavy steel armour that the knights wore furnished in general an ample protection. The only serious danger to be feared was that of coming unwarily upon a superior party of the enemy lying in ambush to entrap the reconnoitrers, and in being surrounded by them. But Richard had so much confidence in the power of his horse, and in his own prodigious personal strength, that he had very little fear. So he scoured the country in every direction, at the head of a small attendant squadron, whenever he pleased, considering such an excursion in the light of nothing more than an exciting morning ride. Of course, after going out many times on such excursions, and coming back safely, men gradually became less cautious, and exposed themselves to greater and greater risks. It was so with Richard and his troop, and several times they ventured so far as to put themselves in very serious peril. Indeed, Richard once or twice very narrowly escaped being taken prisoner. At one time he was saved by the generosity of one of his knights named Sir William. The king and his party were surprised by a large party of Saracens, and nearly surrounded. For a moment it was uncertain whether they would be able to effect their retreat. In the midst of the fray, Sir William called out that he was the king, and this so far divided the attention of the party as to confuse them somewhat, and break the force and concentration of their attack, and thus Richard succeeded in making his escape. Sir William, however, was taken prisoner, and carried to Saladin, but he was immediately liberated by Richard's paying the ransom that Saladin demanded for him. Another time, word came to him suddenly in the town that a troop of the Knights Templars were attacked and nearly surrounded by Saracens, and that, unless they helped immediately, they would all be cut off. Richard immediately seized his armour and began to put it on, and at the same time he ordered one of his earls to mount his horse and hurry out to the rescue of the Templars with all the horsemen that were ready, saying also that he would follow himself with more men as soon as he could put his armour on. Now the armouring of a knight for battle in the Middle Ages was as long an operation as it is at the present day for a lady to dress for a ball.